Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and I'm back with another deck tech for you guys. So this one I'm actually really excited for. This is Mardu Refurbish for Standard for October. So this deck, what are we doing with this deck? We are just doing shenanigans here. We are able to basically kind of like dredge or otherwise put our good cards into our graveyard and then use Refurbish or Ever After to get them back. That's kind of the TLDR of it. With this deck and with just Standard in general doesn't have graveyard disruption right now. Like, there's no way for people to try and disrupt us from just having fun shenanigans and refurbishing back massive Gearhulks that have great enter the battlefield abilities. And because that's the case, we get to have just a fun time smashing here. So what we're doing with this deck is we're using cards like Cathartic Reunion and Tormenting Voice, otherwise Nahiri's Wrath, and Nahiri herself to put our big creatures in. We take Refurbish, we get our creatures, and one of the biggest things is that we're getting Combustible Gearhulk to deal damage or otherwise fuel our hand, and from there we just end up smashing our opponent. So to start things off, we're going to take a look at our creatures because those are the most important thing because we're actually using those to win the game with. So we have 4 Cataclysmic Gearhulk. We have 4 of each of the Gearhulks in our colors, but 4 Cataclysmic Gearhulk to start things off. So this one is basically going to stem down the field based on multiple types of creatures or multiple types of cards in general that our opponent and I guess us ourselves would have. But the Gearhulk is basically going to take everything down to 1. So 1 creature, 1 planeswalker, enchantment, artifact, so on and so forth. It just doesn't include lands. So with the Gearhulk, like if your opponent's playing multiple creatures and if they just develop a board state that has like a bunch of dudes, maybe their tokens or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You're going to leave them with 1. Same thing goes with like planeswalkers. If they're playing a planeswalker heavy deck, they're just down to 1. Usually it's going to be like their best planeswalker that they have, but it doesn't really matter because usually we're going to find a way to kill it anyway. But even for the case of like things like clues, like if your opponent's been accruing clues off of Tireless Tracker or anything like that, you're able to get rid of all of them with the effect of Cataclysmic Gearhulk because they have to sack down to 1. So there's a lot of really cool instances that you get to interact with the Gearhulk in that sense. One thing to note with playing the Gearhulk is that if you're able to Ever After and you get back a Cataclysmic Gearhulk and like a Noxious Gearhulk or basically any other creature, like you get the white Gearhulk and you get like any other dude that enters the battlefield with it, whenever you're going and choosing your types and you're choosing one type and then sacking everything else, you can choose artifact for one of the Gearhulks and creature for another Gearhulk or a creature for like Emrakul or something like that if you Ever After them back. And you get to retain 2 things. That's like super, super important. Realistically, the only thing you ever end up sacking is like the Caravan if you have a Caravan out. But otherwise, super important to remember that artifact and creature are 2 choosable types for your Gearhulks themselves. So you can retain 2 of them or one of the Gearhulks and another creature otherwise. But I digress. Getting on to the Combustible Gearhulk, that is like the biggest thing. This is the biggest thing in our deck. This is the most important card. This card is just what wins you the games because inexperienced players that don't really know what's going on here are just going to mill and they're going to gamble with it. And that loses them in the game a lot of the time. So the Combustible Gearhulk is either going to draw us 3 cards or it's going to mill us 3 based on what our opponent chooses to do here. So everything's in your opponent's hand. They get to choose what you want to do. Most of the time, they're just going to go, yeah, you can draw 3, whatever. And that's fine for us because letting us draw 3 just fuels our hand and it lets us do more shenanigans, which is great. It's not really immediately winning us the game, but that's just fine. The Combustible Gearhulk, when it mills, though, we have so many cards in this deck that cost like a ridiculous high CMC that getting 3 high CMC cards in a row is basically just losing the game for your opponent. Revealing a Emrakul and having it hit the grave off that effect as well is basically like a death sentence as well because your opponent taking 13 plus whatever else is off the CMC of the other 2 cards is like, that's just literally insane. Like, Emrakul, another Gearhulk, and like a land, that's 19 damage. Your opponent going to 1 like super early in the game is not what they want to be doing, like whatsoever. And usually like that and being able to attack through a couple of turns, or like being able to attack and your opponent has to like jump block or whatever for the next couple of turns gives you the time to just literally do whatever and finish them off with a final point of damage. But usually what ends up happening, even though we play Emrakul like as a 1-up in this deck, is that your opponent mills you early on because like it doesn't really matter, and you get all of the value out of it. You get your 1 Emrakul, you get like a 6 CMC card, and then you get like one of the loot effects. Like you get the Reunion or you get the Tormenting Voice, and you just get all the damage in that way. But going on from there, like your opponent gets to decide based on like what the current state is, like what their life total is, how many cards you have in your hand, and different factors like that, what they want you to actually be able to do with the Gearhulk. But you're always in the driver's seat. No matter what they do, unless you're immediately just losing the game regardless, you're always just ahead of them. So that's the great thing about that Gearhulk, is that is just the engine. That is the absolute fire and flame of this deck, is being able to play that card, and you always get value out of it, unless, like I said, you're already losing. But if you're in the position where you're like losing, chances are you're just going to get back a Noxious Gearhulk, and you're going to find some way to like stabilize, or the Cataclysmic Gearhulk, and then you stabilize. The point of playing the red one is it's fire. So getting on to the Noxious Gearhulk, we're playing 4 of them as well. We have 4 of each. The Noxious Gearhulk is going to enter the battlefield and destroy a creature, and we gain life equal to its toughness. Now that's great. And the other thing that's great about this card is it also has menace. So with a combination of like taking your opponent's creatures down to 1 and then also like destroying something, being able to like combine all of these effects and also have menace on this creature just makes it great for being able to bash in damage. Like chances are your opponent's not going to have a very good way to block the Gearhulk itself, and even if they kill it, it doesn't matter. We play a bunch of reanimate spells, so we just get it back, we kill another creature off, we gain some life, and then we just keep on bashing away at our opponent. Another thing to note with like the enter the battlefield triggers with all of these cards is that the Cataclysmic Gearhulk trigger and the Noxious Gearhulk trigger happen at the same time, so there's this global effect to sack all of your stuff down to 1, while there is also a trigger to kill one of your opponent's things. So if your opponent only has like 1 creature out on the battlefield, then you just get to kill that 1 creature. But if your opponent has 2 creatures out and you kill their best one, then they're still losing their best creature, and then they sack down the 1, which they only have 1. In the case where your opponent has multiple things, basically you just pick their best thing with the Gearhulk, leave them with 2 second best options, and then they're taking the better one of those. You don't get to make your opponent sack down and then kill their 1 thing. That's just not how the triggers work. That's just one thing to remember. We do have 1 Emrakul in this deck. The Emrakul is basically the shenanigans for being able to deal massive damage with the Combustible Gearhulk, but otherwise, the Emrakul you get to cast for 8 or 9. 9 is the most common CMC that you actually get to play the Emrakul for, or rather not CMC, the cost. The CMC is always 13. That's the most common cost that you get to play the Emrakul for. And if you actually get to cast the Emrakul, that's insane, because you get to manipulate your opponent's turn, and there's like very little that they can do to actually like come back, and your cards are like always just good. That's the great thing about this deck, is you always feel like you're in the driver's seat with this. Even whenever you play against aggro is so linear that your cards are just better than theirs. So the Emrakul, if you get to cast it, it's great. You get to take their turn. That's just amazing for you. But otherwise, you can still ever after it. It doesn't have that shuffle-in effect like the old Emrakul does. So if it hits your graveyard, then you get to ever after it and put it on the battlefield. It doesn't have like haste or anything flashy like that, but it doesn't really matter because it still has protection from instants, so your opponent has to find a way to get around it. Otherwise, that's just a 13/13 flying trample, can't be touched by instants, just massive beat stick. So reanimating the Emrakul is definitely a real thing. If you want to push damage through, if you want to push a threat through, the Emrakul is actually one of the ways to do it. Now we also have the Cultivators Caravan. So the Caravan, this card's like so awkward because it's like a necessary evil in this deck. It's another ramp card that gets you into your ever after, but this card's also good because any of the turns where you don't use your mana, like let's say you have the Caravan, you hit your 4th land drop, so you have the 4 mana to refurbish. So you use refurbish to get a Gearhulk back, and you use the Gearhulk effect to do whatever. Whatever happens, you kill one of your opponent's dudes, and or like you draw 3 cards, you mill 3, deal damage, whatever, you're able to use that Gearhulk that you just newly brought into the battlefield, and you're able to crew your Caravan as long as it was already there in a previous turn, and you can attack in for 5. So the Caravan is actually a way to push damage through with this deck outside of just being a rock. So it is there for making mana fixing for you to be able to play Ever After and ramping you into Ever After, but it's also there because that 5 damage is just insane for like killing planeswalkers and stuff like that. You're able to push damage in and just beat your opponent just with the Caravan alone, and I think that's just comical in this type of a deck. We have 2 Nahiri, the Harbinger, so we have 2 in the main, 1 in the sideboard. Nahiri's great for just looting. I found a kind of good middle ground with the loot effects that we have. She's a threat in and of herself, so just being able to have her, you can ult her into getting your Emrakul, you can ult her into another one of the Gearhulks. That card returns back to your hand after attacking in and having its effect, which is amazing. So even if like the Nahiri ult doesn't immediately win you the game, like attacking for 13 with an Emrakul doesn't immediately win you the game, that card's going back to your hand, which is great because you get to like cast a Gearhulk, or you get to just put the Emrakul back in your hand, and that's just fodder for you. Nahiri otherwise lets you get rid of threats as well. Like if your opponent has like any problematic artifact enchantments, whatever, like you may encounter, that's great for that. It's great for getting rid of creatures if you're in like a clunky board state and your hand isn't really the best. But being able to loot off of it is also just really, really amazing. Now we're getting into like the small, like I don't really need to explain these cards very much type cards and effects of the deck. So we have 4 Cathartic Reunion, so discard 2, draw 3 for 2 mana. So you efficiently like cycle 3 cards. The Reunion itself and 2 other cards become a draw 3 effect. So you replace 3 for 3, and you're putting your Gearhulks and you're putting like all the stuff you want in your grave. You fodder it to the grave with this card. This card's just amazing. Like Reunion was just an amazing print card to have printed in Kaladesh for a deck like this, specifically. We also have Tormenting Voice, which is a worse Reunion. Like I say worse because it doesn't do as much for you. Obviously, you're only discarding 1 card and drawing 2, so the implications are much, much different. But even still, its copies like 5 and 6 for us that we need for it that complement the Nahiri otherwise as discard outlets. Another discard outlet that we do play in this deck is Nahiri's Wrath, and this card is just phenomenal. I remember looking at this card before and thinking, wow, this card's really cool, but like, when will I ever get to do anything cool with it? And like, now is the time. Now is the time where I actually get to do something cool in Nahiri's Wrath. So the Wrath is going to allow you to discard X cards. So for those X cards, you're going to get to deal damage to X amount of creatures or planeswalkers, where it's the total CMC of all of the cards you discarded. So, for example, let's say you discard like a Combustible Gearhulk and 2 lands. You're dealing 6 damage, not like split and assigned as you choose. It's 6 damage to 3 different targets, or up to 3 different targets, which I think is just insane. So it's like, you draw, like your opponent controls your turn with like an Emrakul. You draw Emrakul for turn. They didn't, for some reason, get rid of your Nahiri's Wrath, or like you draw, like there's like a bunch of like weird instances where like, let's just assume you get the Nahiri's Wrath and you have Nahiri's Wrath Emrakul, discard your Emrakul to the Nahiri's Wrath, deal 13 damage to their Emrakul. Like that's just the powerhouse of this card. But like on a smaller scale, on a much, much more realistic scale, this card is how you get through planeswalkers and how you get through like the mid-range good creatures, the Verdurious Gearhulks and board states that those cards create. That's how you get through them. Nahiri's Wrath is just the easy way to bang through like most board states that are cluttered up by planeswalkers and creatures. The fact that it hits planeswalkers is huge, and the effect is definitely nothing to just kind of look past. This card is absolutely perfect in this deck. We don't really have the outlet to play 4 of it. Like, it's not a card that you want to play 4 of just because it doesn't replace itself. It doesn't replace any of the cards for you, but the Wrath itself is just amazing. Take my word for it. Whenever you guys put this deck together and play with it, because I'm sure most people will whenever they see these cards, even if it's just a playtest online, it's just insane the plays that you can make with the Wrath, and even just the amount of time that it buys you is insane too. So now for our reanimate stuff, we have 4 Refurbish. So bring back target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and 4 Ever After. So take back 2 creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield. Each of those creatures is a black zombie in addition to its other types, which, like, that doesn't even matter. But we put Ever After onto the bottom of our library. That's so huge because we play Evolving Wilds in this deck, so we're able to shuffle our deck and have the Ever Afters still be in there, which is amazing. All right, so enough of talk of like the main board. Like we got through the main board. It's pretty straightforward for what we're doing. Some of the cards require a little bit more explanation and like the triggers and whatnot that's going on there, but otherwise, getting to the sideboard, we have with the one Nahiri that I explained previously and what it does. You want to have another Nahiri for like the control decks and like decks that can just kind of unpiece your cards and just trade like 1-for-1 removals. Sometimes it's like not really enough to just have the Gearhulks. You want to like commit more threats to the board. And if your opponent can't deal with a Nahiri that's going to ult, you're absolutely just going to win the game. Being able to have a card that for a couple of turns or like for 2 turns is going to loot for you, and then on the 3rd turn is going to turn itself into a powerhouse creature, smash with the powerhouse creature, and then put the creature back in your hand so you can recast it. Like that's just enormous for you. So the Nahiri is like for the slower decks, where your opponent might be playing stuff like Transgress the Mind and stuff against you. So like bringing in the Nahiri, it just makes more of your dead cards less dead cards whenever it comes to your opponent actually looking at your hand and trying to unpiece your stuff. Next we have Radiant Flames. So we have a playset of Radiant Flames dealing converge damage to all of our creatures on the board. So this is mainly for like the aggro decks. You're able to make 3 colors in this deck, so you get the full value out of it. You can deal 3 to the board, and you can stem any damage that your opponent might be trying to deal to you in the early game, and you just survive. That's your card to survive. It's pretty straightforward. Same thing goes with Fumigate. Fumigate's for bigger board states. Same implication, destroy all creatures. You gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way for 5. It's another way to get through Emrakul boards, especially for like the merge decks, because you need to kind of have like a good way to get rid of that card. It's usually kind of problematic if you're not able to like get around it. Like obviously Noxious Gearhulk is an insane way to do it because you can just play the Gearhulk and kill the Emrakul, but you also have to worry about your opponent taking your turn, and it's not always perfect. Fumigate is just a perfect answer to Emrakul outside of them being able to recur it. So Fumigate is just, again, for like cluttered board states. Another card that I found somewhat useful has been Perpetual Timepiece. So the Timepiece is another card that I like to side in for grindy matchups just because I never really want to run out of resources. I never want to deck myself. So being able to loop everything around once is kind of perfect for you. So knowing that you're siding in the Perpetual Timepiece, it's not a card that you want to discard. It's not a card that you want to just immediately get rid of. Sure, you can refurbish it. You can return it back onto the battlefield from your graveyard by casting Refurbish, but that's like not what we want to be doing. The Timepiece itself, we can put onto the battlefield, and each turn we can tap it to put the top 2 cards of our library into our graveyard, which is amazing because it fuels more stuff in our graveyard. Like if we have our Refurbishes and Ever Afters in our hand, but we don't have the creatures to actually do anything with, we can Timepiece, put stuff into our graveyard, and get stuff back, which is awesome. But otherwise, the Timepiece, whenever you get to the late game, whenever you, like, let's say you have your Gearhulks, like, you have this just hand of, like, combustible Gearhulks, but all of your good stuff's gone. Like, you know your deck is just full of lands and, like, reunions and voices, like, stuff that, like, it really doesn't matter if you hit those. So being able to Timepiece, put your good cards back in your deck, and then work from there with, like, a newly recycled set of resources is pretty good. The card's like not good itself. The fact that at any point in time you have the ability to kind of loot into this card and recycle and like renew your library full of good cards that you get to play with yet again is why we play this as like a singleton in the sideboard. Going into kind of not even like transformational sideboards, because like I don't really want to call it that, but complementary sideboarding in terms of what we're able to do with like reanimation. We have Gisela, Linvala, and Bruna. So we're playing 3 Gisela here for the aggro decks. So we never want to lose to an aggro deck. That's like our most problematic thing, is just being too slow and losing to aggro. So we get to play cards like Gisela that are really going to clunk up the board for our opponent. A creature that has lifelink first strike and is a 4/3 for 4 is just amazing. It also has evasion too, so if we need to actually like attack in, we're able to do that. But the fact that it blocks like Smuggler's Copters and has first strike to kill them first is definitely remarkable. The Gisela, even if it dies for some reason, we're able to like fodder it to the graveyard, and we can get it back, and we can meld with Bruna to make our Bracella, which most decks, like the aggro decks, they don't have a good way to deal with that, especially if they're curved tops at like 3, maybe 4 if they're playing the 4 cost, like turn itself into a dude vehicle. Like if you make a Bracella against like an aggro deck that tops at 3, they're just not going to be able to do anything. They just lose. So that's like what our aim is with being able to side this card is Gisela is what's going to buy you the time. It's going to make it hard for your opponent to do anything. If they kill it, that's fine. Doesn't really matter. It goes to your grave. You can ever after get it back, get that back in a Gearhulk, or you can just cast the Bruna or ever after into Gisela and Bruna and then just smash them because they can't do anything. We have our Linvala in here, basically like kind of the same implication. This card's much more lackluster. If you have less creatures than your opponent, you get a 3/3. If you have less life, you gain life. So that's great. It also has a pretty good body for the 6 cost for it. You can ever after into it. Otherwise, you can just cast it, which is perfectly reasonable as well at 6. We do kind of ramp with the Caravan, so it's not completely far-fetched for us to actually cast it against one of these aggro decks. But our Bruna in here that we play as a 1 of, that one's a little bit more like unrealistic at 7. Like 7's kind of awkward. Like 6 is kind of pushing it. Like we can ramp into 6 and be comfortable, like knowing that, oh, maybe I'll take a few hits, but then I'll play my 6 drop. Playing a 7 drop's a little bit more awkward, but it's still perfectly reasonable to Bruna and just be able to stabilize a game just because your opponent's not casting cards. I still like to play like a Bruna and a Gisela and be able to side those in, even against like control decks, because sometimes you're able to meld it and your opponent can't do anything to get rid of it. Like they're playing Ruinous Pass and stuff like that, cards that just won't hit that card, especially if they can't unpiece it before they meld, like if they can't grasp it or anguish on making one part or the other, then they're actually in a whole lot of trouble. And then they still have to worry about the rest of our cards, which is great. And then the very last card here that we get to talk about is Collective Brutality. So this is against the control decks. This is against all this slow, grindy stuff, but absolutely anything that's playing counter magic. Collective Brutality is great against counter magic. We get to have a outlet to where we can discard stuff, but the stuff that we're discarding, even though it's not drawing us cards, we get to look at our opponent's hand and we get to take instants or sorceries away from them, just 1 per realistically. So we get to like get information about what our opponent has, what we have to play around, whether it's board wipes, counter spells, anything like that. We get to take a card away from them. But otherwise, this card is actually still good against aggro too. So there's 2 spectrums of implication with this card where if we play against aggro, we're able to kill one of our opponent's dudes, gain back some life. And if we want to, we can look at their hand. That's usually not the case like ever, but being able to cast the Brutality against something like the Thermo Burn deck, having an outlet to dump your hand and actually like get cards out of your hand to not have to take damage off of a Fevered Vision or something like that is great. But you definitely get a wide variety of different matchups where you get to side in the Brutality, and it's good just because for one reason or another, it's doing something for you outside of letting you put stuff in your graveyard, which is perfect for us. So that is the deck tech here for Mardu Refurbish. The deck list is down in the description below outside of being on the screen that you guys can see. It's written out for you. You can use it as a reference. You can steal it, play it at FNM, play test it online, whatever you will. Have fun with it. I know I'm definitely having a lot of fun playing this deck and playtesting with it. If you enjoy the deck tech, if you want to see more content, please be sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel for more content, updates, news, all that fun stuff. And until next time, guys, thank you for joining me. Thank you for sitting through this lengthy discussion of a Mardu Refurbish. Until next time, peace out.